A bit of George Ezra there, right here on the Final Hour, the A-Team, calling you, and Mary still with you, of course, on a lovely Tuesday, isn't it?
Yep, and on Tuesdays we've got Breakfast with the CEO. Today we are talking to the CEO of Crops for the Future, Professor Sayed Azam-Ali. Professor, welcome to the studio.
Morning, thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us this morning. And if you perhaps are curious about Crops for the Future, it's the world's first center dedicated to research on underutilized crops for food and non-food uses. They focus on the uses of agricultural biodiversity to address changing climates, diversity crop and agricultural systems. They improve food security and economic well-being and improve nutrition. Do I get an A for that?
You've done the job for me, thank you. Can I go now?
No, please, no. Talk to us a little bit further.
Okay, I'm looking at the vision and mission statement, Professor, and it's really quite incredible what you guys do, but maybe you can distill it for us. Crops for the Future. Where did it start, and what was the idea behind it, and the whole language and all that? Trying to understand it more from the layperson's perspective.
Well, let me put it round the other way.
Okay.
And ask you a question. If we said, I'll give you a clue, there's 500,000 plant species in the world, right? So on the planet, 500,000 different types of plants. How many actually support the 7 billion people on the planet? How many crops do we actually grow that feed the world? Give me a number.
I could not give you a number. I could not. Or is it
Thousands? Hundreds?
Hundreds, I would say.
Right.
thousands?
3.
Really?
Yeah.
Just 3?
So way off the mark.
Right, so you start with half a million plants on the planet, of which Malaysia has actually got 5%. So this is the second richest source of global biodiversity on land, and the richest source of biodiversity in the oceans. And we grow 3 crops: wheat, rice, maize, for more than half the world's food. Now that's crazy.
That is crazy, because there are so many other plants that could be used.
You would say that, and I would say that, but it's very hard to persuade people who are familiar with the big crops. And of course 3 is more than half the world, but if you add them all up, maybe 20, 25, 30 feed the whole world. And you go, anyone, just imagine, I don't know, a Martian landing on the planet and saying, crikey, they've got these millions, thousands of species, and we're down to about 3 to feed all these people. And as they increase, the population goes from 7 billion to 9 billion, these 3 crops are going to have to feed more and more people in more and more volatile climates, and you go, shouldn't someone do something about this?
Right.
That's what we're doing.
That makes a lot of sense now. We put it in better perspective. But okay, Professor, you mentioned only 3 have grown to become, how should we say, the main staples all around the world for all of us living on planet Earth.
All around the world.
What happened to the rest? I mean, was it basically a factor of numbers and profit?
I mean, they're great crops, so let's not pretend, and we shouldn't stop growing maize, wheat, rice, soybean, all these crops we're familiar with. We grow them in different countries, we consume them in different countries, move them around the planet. So no one says they're not important crops. The question is, and I'll give you an analogy, we all love English football in Malaysia, and if I pick the big teams, we say Manchester City, Chelsea, Arsenal. There's another one I can never remember there. What's that 4th team? Another Manchester. I can't remember that. Anyway, you pick those 4 and you say, let's put all our money in 4 football clubs and ignore the others.
Right.
You would then be saying, basically, that's what we're doing with agriculture, because we're backing the top and we're saying the rest, by definition, they're no good. They're not the big crops. Now, if you ended up with just 4 football clubs, no one would watch football, because the same teams would be playing each other all the time.
Yeah, and the smaller teams would not get any attention.
They disappear, and of course, if they disappear, that affects us. And of course, in football, it affects us as well. But in food terms, it affects us enormously, because once you lose those crops, you keep them in some botanical collection. But if you're not using them, you're not finding products from them, you're not improving them, you're not doing research on them, then actually those crops will disappear. So the gap between the big and the smaller crops gets bigger and bigger the more we invest in just those few crops.
Well, you mentioned earlier that it's hard to persuade people. Why is that? Is it because not many people understand about the other crops?
Yeah, I think, if you just think of careers, you just think of science, we do what we're familiar with. I'm working on wheat, let's carry on working. I mean, when I first became an academic and I went to work in the university, my senior colleague, my professor, said, just work with me on my crop and you'll be successful. Forget all these stupid crops that everyone, they're underutilized. They're underutilized for a reason. In other words, we shouldn't bother working on them because already we've discovered they're no good. Well, that's a silly argument because we haven't looked at them. So if you think of careers, you think of investment, you think of policy, you think of government, they're going to back winners, and the winners are already in front of them, the big crops. So someone has to make a mind change. You have to actually change the mindset of when I say persuade, you have to persuade a whole range of stakeholders that these crops have actually got a potential, and we should look at those crops simply because there must be something about them, they're still around.
Agreed.
If we could actually find uses for them, we could justify what we call biodiversity is actually also agricultural biodiversity. If we could find uses for these crops, we're going to expand biodiversity.
Right. Speaking of which, besides the three that you mentioned, Professor, and of course other crops like soybean and whatnot, how many others are actually edible from a long-term perspective and able to give sustenance
Well,
to
if
the
you
average
take
human
human
being?
history, and of course that means we haven't found all those crops,
That's right.
there's 30,000 plants that human beings have used for their food. 30,000. Now, it doesn't mean all 30,000 should be used, but it means about 7,000 have been grown as crops throughout our history. So, of course, we've been collecting plants from the wild, and of course we still do that in many parts of the world, but 7,000 crops have been grown throughout human history, and we're now down to the dozen or so that feed most of the planet. So those 7,000 have got potential, that some of them have potential to be crops for the future. That's why we call it crops for the future. It's not let's just go backwards and see what we had a long time ago and just do something for history. We're actually looking at crops for the future.
Okay, well, listening to you speak, Professor, you're very passionate about your work. We can see. Is this something that was always something that you had? You know, were you always passionate about working in agriculture and studying crops?
I started in a small garden in South London with my uncle, and of course from then you start getting interested in plants, and you go to university, you do a degree, but actually the passion comes from what's obviously in front of us and what we ignore. Now, I say this because it pains me in Malaysia that we have such diversity, yet we actually ignore it. It's in front of us. Every time you drive along the road, you'll see weeds, you see plants growing in it. You know, most of my research in Africa, which is a much tougher environment, where plants find it hard, people find it hard. And, you know, sometimes when you look in Malaysia and say, we actually don't literally see the wood for the trees, because we've seen these plants and we ignore them. So that's where the passion comes from, the obvious potential of these plants that could be useful, and we actually ignoring them because we say, well, someone else must have looked at them already, they're probably no use, why should we bother with them? We've got big crops, we've got oil palm, we've got rice, all true. We're ignoring what's in front of us.
And you've got about 52 people in your company currently. How do you infect them with all this passion of yours?
Well, you'll have to ask them, but because the big picture is so obvious,
Right.
what we're dealing with here isn't making plastic ducts in a factory. We're dealing with something which is
That
global,
affects globally,
affects everybody, and we are a big experiment. If it works, the company model we have has a potential to be significant in all sorts of ways, lots of different ways that the companies are set up. We're a company limited by guarantee. We're not a straightforward university, we certainly aren't. We're not a straightforward company just making profits. We're a research company. That model is something which we think has got potential for lots of other ways of doing business. So that's one thing, and I think when actually people get to work in the morning, I think they see that what we're trying to do is useful. And
Absolutely.
useful makes people interested, I think.
And it wakes
in their
people
job.
up, doesn't it?
Wakes people up. Speaking of that, one quick question before we go for our first song break, Professor. How did that come about, the story of how your company was founded? Maybe run through a brief history
Well,
with us.
yeah, I mean, this is something where, again, the government in Malaysia have been fantastic supporter, because there was an international competition, international call to host Crops for the Future. 13 countries bid, and when I was with the University of Nottingham bid to host that international centre here in Malaysia, at the Malaysia campus in Seminyak. Now, we then got the support of Dato Sri Najib, who said this is something which Malaysia should support. There should be an international leadership role for Malaysia. That's how we actually established it as a company limited by a guarantee, in which government of Malaysia and the University of Nottingham became guarantors, but not owners. They said, okay, we like the idea, get on with it, we'll back you. So that company model is actually something which we established, but it became a global company, so that the idea that it's registered in Malaysia but actually has international partners that's really the strength of the model.
Definitely. We're going to take a quick break right here on the A-Team. It's Breakfast with the CEO. We're talking to CEO of Crops for the Future, Professor Sayed Azam-Ali, right here on TraxxFM.
We'll be right back.
It's 9:30 a.m. Good morning to you. Professor Sayed Azam-Ali, CEO of Crops for the Future, joins us this morning on Breakfast with the CEO.
Really, really awesome concept. It came about a collaboration between, of course, the University of Nottingham, which does a lot of awesome work, I think, in academics in general, as well as in cooperation, of course, with the Malaysian government. Crops for the Future. Really, really awesome concept, yeah. I'm going to get you, Professor, to just summarize, because I'm sure we've got some listeners who are just fresh on board right now, wondering what's happening in the interview. What's it all about?
All the big crops of the world, and we've all heard of them, have got international centres. So you take the nearest one, probably. We got one in the Philippines called the International Rice Research Institute. It's about rice, surprise, surprise. And it's only about rice.
Right.
That means if you take all the big crops, 15 or so international centres, what about all the rest of them? That's our job. So that's why it's, as you say, awesome. The project potential is huge, because all these alternative plants haven't had a home till now. They haven't had a centre that just says, that's what we do. We look at all these alternative crops. So that's the project.
It's all about biodiversity of crops, agriculture, and to enlarge the whole gamut of things, so it covers a lot more than just the top 3 crops that Professor mentioned earlier on.
And taking a look at all the potential of other crops as well. I mean, let's say, for example, I'm going sci-fi here, if rice were to go extinct.
Yeah.
You know,
that's
or
the risk.
maize.
That's the risk. Not just the extinct, but it's climate changes, which it is. Can they grow in the best environments? You know, when we start putting them in very difficult places, are those crops still going to be able to grow? And the other thing, which is really what we're all about, is we aren't just naming these new crops. We're just not saying, here's the next 10, you know, they're going to be the big crops of the future. What we're looking at is end uses. So we're looking at food, of course, we're looking at non-food, looking at nutrition. So we look at fruits and vegetables that actually encourage people to eat better diets. And we look at, even, if I give a good example, fish. And we say, well, crops of the future, what have they got to do with fish? Well, actually, when we feed fish in aquaculture, in our farmed fish, we're feeding them with fish, which is stupid, because we're actually catching fish in the oceans, tiny little fish, could be big fish. We capture them and we put them in a pond and we feed them to fish as fish meal. And then we give those fish big plants like maize and wheat and so on, and those plants that we use as food crops as feed for fish. Now what we're doing is looking at insects and saying, can you feed insects to fish as the protein instead of fish meal? And better than that, can you feed these insects on these underutilized crops?
Right.
You've now got a source of very high quality protein that replaces little fish, and you can replace those big crops that we're putting into fish feed with these local crops that we can grow to replace the imported crops that we're bringing in for fish feed.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's talking about taking fish from the sea, which is already an issue for Malaysia, and of course you're finding almost like an alternative chain for the crops to actually be used in a way that makes more sense. Now, but all of this is very multidisciplinary. It's got so many overlaps. It's a lot of the work basically research.
It is, and I can, you know, we quote this. What we call our research model is called a research value chain. Okay. Now, one of the challenges in big institutions, universities, government agencies, is people do what they're familiar with in their subject. So if I do my research, it's going to be in my subject.
Right.
What about all the other people that I have to connect with, all the other subjects? Now, if you just take agriculture, you grow crops in a field generally, and you take them a long way from where they're grown to a supermarket where people buy them and they consume them. That's a supply chain. Our research follows that supply chain. So we look at crops, yes, we look at production, but we look at transport, we look at product development, we look at consumption, we look at marketing, social, you know, why do people not eat these crops? What is their reaction when we give them a new product? That's all part of our research. So it is research, but it's multidisciplinary research across that value chain, right down to products and end users.
I think that's fascinating. A lot of people are probably wondering, okay, well, what's the big deal? I mean, it doesn't look like all of these 3 different crops that you mentioned earlier. It's always available, always available. What's the big deal about studying other crops and all that? And I think you make a big difference today, Professor, explaining all of this to everybody.
Right, because it is a big deal, yeah?
It is a
What's
very
a
big deal.
equally bigger deal is how do you, Professor, manage all these different disciplines? How do you integrate them into what you do? I mean, I assume that CFF Crops for the Future is organized by departments, and that's how you oversee everything.
Sort of, yeah. Departments, it sounds like, very, bureaucratic, and we put people in boxes. Actually, we have programs, and those programs are multidisciplinary.
I see.
And so we have program directors and program teams working on these end uses, so food, non-food, fish, as I gave you an example. So these program teams have to be very disciplined, but the discipline is their own. They have to sit down and say, how do we link all these different parts of the value chain? I don't manage that. My staff will tell you I'm a rubbish manager, because managing is actually not my job. Leading's my job. At the end of the day, all I have to do is set up very bright people in teams to get on with the job. And I only intervene if we're not making the right progress, we're going sometimes in the wrong direction, or we need to refocus. That really is where I come in. But trying to give a direction to the whole company so that we don't just work in these little silos that we're traditionally used to. We bring all these people together, and you put talented people together. Of course, you create new ideas that weren't there before we started, but you have to keep that discipline. Otherwise, we'll be all over the place. All these crops, all these products, different parts of the world.
So many people,
how on earth do you keep all of that together? There's got to be discipline.
Oh, I love how you say that your job is to lead, which I agree. What would you say, Professor, makes a good leader? I mean, there's a difference between being the boss and the leader, right? So, from your experience,
I think you give people confidence and you let them get on with the job. The problem sometimes is people don't want to take that challenge. Sometimes people are very familiar with being told what to do. They're very familiar with literally being managed. And then if you say, look, I want you to take leadership, I want you in your own area to take ownership over your programs, that is the challenge. Now, to do that, you pick the best people, and we've got some fantastic people. And if you actually look at that talent, and it's not at the top, it's at the bottom. I mean, if you actually look at the talent pool we've got, and you say, Malaysia talent, this is outstanding talent. Now, you put those people together. What you then have to do sometimes avoid the sparks, try and cool the pace down a bit sometimes between people. But if they can work together, that teamwork is far, far better than the traditional scientists sitting in their laboratory looking at a microscope on their own and then thinking, what do I do with all of this? Because they haven't actually got a connection with the end users of the research they're doing.
Well, tell us, we're going to move on to your personal life just a little bit. I mean, tell us the difference between Professor Sayed, the CEO, and Professor Sayed, the dad and husband. How do you
want a music break
that?
first? It's very difficult because obviously when you say passionate, of course the work is, it's very, very absorbing, and of course the work becomes part of the I mean, I'll give you maybe a silly example, but we, Southern Rock Seafoods in Bangsar, last week did a sample testing of our food products, and it's a seafood restaurant, wonderful restaurant, but they're now using our crops as products in a top-end restaurant. Now, of course, how does that work? Well, my son's working as a waiter there, and he does his work experience. We then get a chance to get Josh Green, the owner, to actually give us a chance to sample, present some of these foods, these ingredients that his chefs are making into cuisine. Now that's combining work with family. And my mum went along, and everyone went along, and of course that's my justification. But football, cricket, sport in general, those sorts of things that you like to do with your son, and that's really something.
That's pretty awesome.
Many people always talk about the distinction between kind of what you just said, Mary.
Yeah,
isn't it?
the boss and the family man.
But I personally think that a lot of times you don't have to keep them so separate. You just kind of leverage between what needs to be shared, and there's a lot of sharing, inter sharing that any one of us can do, isn't it? Between work and family.
I don't think you put them in different boxes. I think you have to connect them. But of course you have to explain, you can't just say, I'm sorry, I'm out of here because I've got to sit down and work on something. You've got to explain what you're trying to do.
True.
If people get interested in that, then of course, we've just released, we're launching on the 26th of September. And the Prime Minister is going to be our guest of honor. He's going to be there because our brand new HQ is going to be open. They're wonderful. If you ever go on the website, you'll see these 3 domes as if they've landed from outer space. Our facilities, which will be iconic. And we're releasing a series of videos. So over the next few weeks, we're going to release these very short videos, 2-3 minutes long, telling the story of Crops of the Future and what we're doing till we get to the launch. Now, all of those stories are actually our own people, and they're developing these stories, and Shazwan, who's done a great job in making these videos interesting, because of course academics can end up talking about the science and the technology and all the DNA and all the rest of it. Actually, it's about why does this matter to people. So those videos which are now out on YouTube and Facebook, those are ones that I think we really want to get out into the public domain, so that they should get interest. This is a public story. This is not a company doing research in a laboratory that we don't want people to come and see.
Absolutely.
You're right, though. We need to get people's attention, especially now that they know that there are hundreds of thousands of crops out there, millions, and only 3 are the most utilized in the entire planet. So, yeah, we're talking to Professor Sayed right here on the Breakfast with the CEO. Crops for the Future is the name of the company. You can find out more online, of course, at Crops for the Future on YouTube, Crops for the Future on Twitter, as well as Crops for the Future Research Center on Facebook. We'll be back after a quick break.
That's right. More with the good professor in just a little while. Meanwhile, of course, this is the A-Team. Stay tuned, and we'll be right back. Coming up to 9:45 a.m., you're back on the A-Team with me, Kong, you, and Mary. Joined this hour by Professor Sayed Azam-Ali, who is the CEO. I added another E there. He's the CEO of Crops for the Future since its establishment in August 2011. And here's the great thing. It's located in our backyard, University of Nottingham's Meunier. And it's actually a landmark of actually 3 domes, isn't it?
That's right.
You can't miss it if you're in Meunier, I'm sure.
It's pretty cool. It's like a huge...
Actually, the design, they look at the domes and people say, what's the design? I say, it's a turung saji.
I like that.
They say we're dealing with alternative crops, and let's have a cover that's familiar, iconic, Malaysian, but actually using biomaterials. In fact, we're using malagunga, which is a Malaysian tree species, ironwood from Borneo, and that tree material is being used to create these biodomes, inside which we're doing research on alternative crops.
That's absolutely, it's very creative.
Yeah, we should make a visit there sometime.
Yeah.
Anytime, you'll be our guest.
We'll put it on on Facebook and all that.
Definitely.
It'll be awesome. Yeah.
Well, talking about working in your field, Professor, what are some of the setbacks that you go through? Not everyday setbacks and challenges that you often go through.
Bureaucracy, inertia. I mean, these are challenges, setbacks. Well, we have to get over. We have to overcome them. But the problem is always persuading people that we want to move forward, and everyone says, "Well, what have you done so far?" I guess that's the case with every startup. People say, "What have you done so far?" And you say, "Well, look what we're doing, and look at the speed that we're doing it." And then put that into the context of if you were any big organization, how quickly they might have moved. We've moved, whatever the word for very quick is. Very quickly we've moved to where we are now, but it's not fast enough because we still have to make products and demonstrate proof of concept is actually usable for people. So that's the critical stage now, demonstrating what we have is of value when we're still doing the research. We've got to keep doing the research, but we've got to start getting products out that people start tasting, literally. We've got some fantastic products which we're now testing. Take a kadongdong. We've all heard of kadongdong.
Yes, of course.
We all drink it and say, oh, it's a bit astringent, it's a bit sharp. We've made, my colleague Dr. Miang Lim and her Food Plus team have made this fantastic drink out of kadongdong, which is effervescent. It's like a ginger, like a ginger beer. Now, I'll give you a name, Janine Alice. Have you heard of her?
I'm sorry, no.
You've heard of Boost Bars?
Uh-huh.
Right. Well, she is the inventor of Boost Bars with a $2 billion turnover, and she invented fruit juices and smoothies in her kitchen in Adelaide. And she's now in 17 countries with Boost Bars. And how did she do it? She knew she had a good product, and she kept going, overcoming those obstacles and hurdles till she actually got an international brand, and she's a multimillionaire. Now, the point is she had a good product to start with, but she didn't give up the first time people said, well, you know, why should we do that? We can have orange juice. So she actually started making products, not in a bottle, but you could go and see it being made in front of you. You saw the ingredients going in, you saw the fruit juice, you could drink it fresh, full of nutrients. Now we can do that with these hundreds of fruits that we've got in Malaysia.
Starting with Kedondong.
With Kedondong.
It's this fizzy, like soda-like Kedondong.
Yeah, very refreshing. We had the British High Commissioner here with us there actually at the CFF headquarters last week. She loved it because it's refreshing and it's not too sweet.
And it's different. Right.
And people are interested in different things, aren't they now?
They are, very much so. Speaking about working with other people, you know, and all the other companies that you have worldwide, you travel a lot, I understand.
We don't have companies. Well, we have partners. We're an alliance, and of course we're a single legal entity here, but we have 32 partners around the world. And those partners get it. They understand what we're trying to do. They want to work with us. They offer their facilities. They offer their expertise. Of course, they might be working on big crops as well. It's not a problem. We always have to compare ourselves with the big crops. We're not in a separate world. You know, it's not a parallel universe here. When we work with them, we have to keep those partnerships. And the ones that are active will carry on, but we've got to keep working on those active partnerships and building alliances. That's the brand. That's the international brand that we're trying to develop. It's light touch. It's not where the headquarters here and everyone is, you know, it's not a big sort of multinational bank where everybody does exactly the same thing in all the different branches. But if we don't build that critical mass, the value that we can provide is very, very limited. Even if we're here in Malaysia, we can only do so much because these plants are all over the world.
Have you ever thought, Professor, how you're able to do exactly that? Deal with people from all over the world, different countries, different cultures, different types of people, and even within what you do, being the CEO, managing, even in your way, leading by leadership and by example, the different areas of expertise, different people. You've got professors, you've got researchers, mostly, a lot of people in academia, as well as others. How do you deal with
that's a really good question. That's a really good challenge because academics, quite rightly, in a university environment, do what they do. They research and they teach and they provide, you know, the education for their students. Bringing researchers who are from an academic background into a company, who then have to have an end use and have to drive the business model, which is actually working to a very different type of discipline, that's enormously challenging. Of course, you have to have the right people who understand that's what we're trying to do, and they're actually partners in that. And we're multinational. So even as 52, and I can't remember exactly how many, but I guess we've got 12, 13, 14 nationalities. Those nationalities have to work together, not in silos, not in their own groups. And of course, we work with international partners around the world. And we have to not just overcome the time difference, but the cultural differences and the histories of how people work and used to work with each other. So I don't pretend it's not a big challenge. It's enormous.
But it is, and everybody's working towards, you know, a single goal to do as much research as possible, and, you know, to get the news out there to the public.
That's not the goal, to do as much research as possible. The goal is actually to be the best. Now, we always say we're the only centre for alternative crops. You know, we're the world's first and only centre for underutilized crops. So we're the best.
Right.
That's not good enough. We have to be the best against all the big centres. In other words, if you worked on rice and you then came to see us, you go, these guys are as good as us.
Right.
We have done it at the same quality, international standard that the big centres have done. That's the vision. Now that is, you know, keeps me awake at night, keeps all of us awake at night, because we set ourselves a very high challenge. But if we don't set the high challenge, they go, well, it's cottage industry, they're doing stuff in backyard, and, you know, basically it's not going to make any real difference because it's not serious.
Well, where do you see crops for the future in, let's say, 10 years, Professor?
It has to be world leader, because that means it's comparable with big centres, and what we do has to be out there. In other words, the public. And one of the key issues for us is public interest becoming public commitment. Crowdfunding, public sources of support, because it isn't something even this government or any national government can just underwrite. You know, these are risky projects. We're not just going to come up with quick wins. So we want the public to understand that biodiversity includes agriculture. And we've grown up in schools thinking, well, there's the natural rainforest and saving the planet, and there's agriculture.
Right.
Well, actually, agriculture is more than half the world's land area. So if we can't save agriculture, we can't save the planet. So biodiversity has to be a public agriculture biodiversity has to be a public good.
Cool. You know what? Before we're running out of time really,
Yeah, we
really
are.
fast, about
Yes.
9:53 on the clock. Final question for you, Professor. Anybody who's been tuning in at the moment who has gotten to know you and is very is admiring your work, what advice would you have for them? You know, somebody who has passion but doesn't know where to go, doesn't know who to talk to, and would someday like to lead the way you do.
I think people have to be, passion's good and having a good idea is good, but if you're not persistent and focused on the long game, every day there'll be setbacks, and every day you walk in and you think, we've got to overcome another hurdle, and every day you think, is it worth it? Well, you don't. You say, we're going to overcome this hurdle. So that persistence, and I'd give the example of Boost Juice, just topical just now that I've been reading about her, but all of these success stories have been through sheer doggedness and persistence, that they understood what the problem was and they were not going to give up till they actually made some contribution. Because we're doing something which is globally significant. It's not just making profits.
Right.
It's actually leaving a legacy. That's the challenge.
Well, thank you so much for joining us this morning, Professor. I think we
My
both
pleasure.
learned a lot, and we certainly hope we can speak to you in the future.
I'm
Seriously.
very happy to.
CEO of Crops for the Future, Professor Sayed Azam-Ali, joining us this morning on Breakfast with the CEO. Happens every single Tuesday, 9:15 a.m. to 10 a.m. right here on Trax.
Right here on the A Team. Thank you so much, Professor. And of course, we're out of time. Fast heading into the 10 a.m. Quick news updates, and after that into a little show called Trax Momentum. So stay tuned. Meanwhile, of course, it's Kong Yu and Mary signing out for the day.
Thank you so much for joining us. And if you want to find out more about Crops for the Future, look for them on Facebook, Crops for the Future Research Center, or on Twitter, Crops for the Future, and YouTube, Crops for the Future as well.
Alrighty, good morning, and stay tuned. Keep it right here on Trax.